we should not just simply try and get back to the so-called normal. We should use this time to conceive of a better way forward.
Hi, everybody. It's Linda Lorelle. Really glad that you joined us today for this episode of our Voices Matter podcast. There's quite a personal connection for me in today's interview. My guest is Sonia Jarvis. Sonia is a distinguished lecturer and the director of the Center on Equality, Pluralism, and Policy at Baruch College of Public Affairs. Sonia and I were at Stanford together, Stanford University, and the reason that we initially decided to get together and have this conversation is to pay tribute to a very dear friend of ours by the name of Charles Ogletree. Charles, also a Stanford classmate and friend, is a very revered and honored professor at Harvard University. He has made some tremendous contributions in the civil rights arena through the years. And Sonia and I came together to really do an interview that helps pay tribute to Charles and his legacy as part of an event that we're putting together with some of our other Stanford classmates. But there is so much more to Sonia than her friendship and relationship with Charles through the years and the work that they have done together as attorneys. So in this conversation, you will hear us talk about Charles and the amazing things that he has done in his career, but also the incredible things that Sonia has done in her career and some unique places that she herself holds in the history of our country. So I hope you will enjoy this very personal conversation between Sonia Jarvis and me, and that you will take away some of the nuggets that she has to share with us. So enjoy. Sonia Jarvis, what a pleasure to get to see you again after all these many years and to catch up on all things Sonia. And how are you, my dear?
I am so well, Linda. And as I told you before, I've been looking forward to this all week after we had a chance to just chitty chat a bit and, catch up on all the stuff that's been going on with you and with me.
Oh my gosh, there's lots to talk about, but we have to start with kudos to the Stanford women Cardinal, new national basketball champions. And the reason we are starting there is because of your groundbreaking role as the first Black female varsity athlete at Stanford University back in the day. So I know you must have thought back to that time when they won the championship. So tell me what your thoughts are after all of this time.
Well, thank you so much for that, Linda. It's just been wonderful on so many different levels. First, because I remain a huge basketball fan of the team, and to have the school reach out to me and say, hey, wait a second, we've got some more to say about you and your role in the development of the basketball team at Stanford, the women's team. So that before and after thing has just been amazing over the last 2 months. I got a call from Stanford. They had assigned a reporter to do some research on Black History Month in terms of past athletes. And in their research, according to the reporter, David Kiefer, it appeared I was the first one. And he said, didn't you know this? I was like, no, I didn't know this. How was I going to know this?
You had no idea?
I knew there weren't a lot of us.
Right, of course.
But I didn't know I was the first. And then it wasn't just basketball, it's like the first period. And
first Black female athlete at Stanford.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I then kind of interviewed my classmates at the time. I said, well, this can't possibly be true. Who else And they were like, well, it wasn't tennis. It wasn't field hockey. It wasn't soccer. And by the time we got to the end of the list, it was like, it looks like it might be you.
Looks like it must be you. Oh, my gosh. So,
Yes.
All right. So I've got a little quote from what I believe is the article that you're referencing now that was in Stanford Magazine. I'm going to read it. And it says, in the mid-1970s, equal treatment was only on paper in the form of a civil rights law called Title IX that prohibits gender-based discrimination in education. Jarvis and teammate Stephanie Erickson Colbert, 77, and Mariah Maggie Burton Nelson, 78, knew Stanford was at a crossroads between reluctance and acceptance, and chose to endure rejection and avoidance from administrators in exchange for the perseverance that leads to all worthwhile things. So when you hear that, and so going back to the rejection and avoidance, talk a little bit about what that was.
Sure.
And how you were able to work your way through that.
Well, the thing is, Linda, it was really, as it started, just wanting to play in a gym where I wouldn't run into the wall. Okay. At Robley.
That would be Robley.
That would be Robley. It was not a standard sized gym. And the second was just feeling that with the new gym being built, well, wait a second, why aren't we there too? So it was really more a questioning rather than let's go get the administration. It was, we could do better than this. Mm-hmm. And then because even at that age, I was paying attention to legal stuff in a way I didn't understand at the time. But I had heard about Title VII. I'm sorry, I'd already heard about Title VII, but I also heard about Title IX. And Title IX said boys and girls sports should be the same. And I took that as, okay, well, let's ask the school why that's not the case. And Stephanie and Mariah were on board, and we just started a campaign where we would show up and keep asking the same questions over and over again.
And I have to stop you there just for 1 second, because that same question was asked during this current NCAA championship season when It went viral, looking at the girls at the women's facility for working out versus what the men had.
Thank you. And there was no excuse for that other than they were able to ignore the women's needs and not provide comparable accommodations. And why did it have to be a scandal? Why wasn't there someone within the NCAA who asked the question, what are we doing? Why are we doing it this way? Mm-hmm. And so for me, it was, again, deja vu all over. It's
been a full circle moment. Yeah.
And because the women's associations that are connected with the NCAA really pushed back hard, I didn't feel I needed to do that. So I think I will probably write an article about it at some point, because we can't keep having the same conversation. We need to make advancements. And this is an example of we haven't. So that's what I thought about when I read that article and said, no, we can't go back. We have to go forward.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what was going on campus back then in the mid-late 70s when we were there. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of, I remember participating in a march against apartheid. And I bring this up because I know that one of our very dear friends, Charles Ogletree, was very involved in making that and many, many other things on campus happen at that time. So I want to spend some time talking about Charles, and we'll get into, some people might recognize his name. For those who don't, we will get into his history because he is worth all of the accolades that that
Absolutely.
we can talk about, including having represented Anita Hill during the Clarence Thomas hearings and being, a revered professor at Harvard University, et cetera. We'll get into all of that. But going back to the mid to late 70s, talk to me a little bit about Charles's role in and the activism that was happening on campus at that time. And you and Charles are very, very close.
Well, I think, Linda, the best way I can introduce that topic and how it played out for me, but also for the campus, is that, remember, during that period, we had just gotten past the turmoil of the 60s, a protest and riots and police brutality and all of that. And yet we hadn't really extended our lens, I don't think, to what was happening outside of our nation. And I view the effort at Stanford, which Charles was a major leader in promoting, was to do that, to ask questions such as, why is Stanford University investing in this type of government, which was discriminating against the majority of its citizens? Mm-hmm. It's a simple question, but it's a complicated answer. And the complicated answer was that if you're an institution, your job is to take funding and maximize it as much as possible. So if you've got a country like South Africa that's making a lot of money and you can invest in it, why wouldn't you? As opposed to asking, why are we investing in this nation where the minority is preventing the majority from realizing a fruitful life? And using that as the starting point of challenging Stanford's investment options was the beginning of that movement. Mm-hmm. And Charles was able to explain it in a way that I don't think had been done before, to say, this is just wrong, let's do better. And to see his activism didn't just start there. I mean, it started there, but it continued for a good part of his career, to be concerned about what was happening in nations outside of the United States with respect to Black people.
And that extended to his work with Nelson Mandela. And I think you were involved in that as well, were you not? Can you share a little bit about that?
Well, what he was doing, what Charles was doing as part of that, was not just advising President Mandela, but also advising the new government on how do you create a new constitution. The Constitution had been adopted in 1948, which was basically legalizing apartheid. So now that had to be undone, and a new constitution had to come into being. And Charles was just brilliant in the way he approached that issue, in explaining it to the government, but also in convincing others like myself to help with that process. And so one of the areas he asked me to look at was language. What languages should be part of the constitutional process? And so I looked at other democracies and gave my opinion, and talked about Canada and a few other nations that clearly had more than one language as an official language. I also referenced the United States, where we don't have an official language, even though people think we do. And then tried to explain that, again, it was important to recognize the different languages within South Africa, but there were 17. And I said, whoa, 17's a lot. Can we do 3? and those who were involved in the discussions were like, no, we can't do 3. The 3 major, because this is about inclusion.
Right.
We have to make sure any public or governmental information we produce can be understood by every sector of this nation. Yeah. And after we did that back and forth, we also talked about issues in terms of women's rights. I mean, it was such a extraordinary period to watch that happen in real time. That was one. But also at home, this was during the Clinton administration, we were trying to pass a new law to make voter registration easier, and I was involved in that process. So the juxtaposition for me was incredible. It's like, whoa, the fight doesn't stop. It continues. And the continuation is, how do you make sure everyone within that community or that country has the right to participate? So eventually, when the South African Constitution was adopted, it was the 17 languages, not the 3. That's just one example.
Fascinating backstory. I had never heard that story before.
Yeah,
that's
but
amazing.
It was about what does inclusion mean?
Yeah.
And we start with language. Now, in our case, I think it's a good thing we don't have an official language. But in terms of how language worked in our electoral process, it was through the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where we said if there's any community or county or state where you have 5% or more of a minority, they can ask for their materials to be produced in their language. So whether it's Spanish, whether it's Chinese, whether it's Japanese, whether it's Native, that's what the Voting Rights Act does. And that came through the 72 amendments to the Voting Rights Act. So 5% or more, you can have it in your own language. But if people don't know that, they don't demand it. So it's still that fight to make sure we are acknowledging that you have the right to be able to understand what you're reading before you vote.
Well, the whole voting rights issue right now is so front and center. I mean, who would have thought this many years later that we're back to almost square one in terms of this fight? And now the efforts to roll back the access to the polls. So yes. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, we could spend the next hour on that.
Or two, just on that. I know.
I'm going to give you the short version. And my short version is, think of it this way, that when we finally passed a constitutional amendment saying that we could not restrict the ballot based on race in 1870 through the 15th Amendment, we didn't go as far as we could have. We could have said you cannot prohibit the right to vote based on race or sex or gender at that time. And we left out the girls. It took another 50 years till we got to the 19th Amendment. And but the important part of the 15th Amendment, it said that Congress may pass legislation to protect that right to vote. And we did not pass that legislation until 1965. It took 95 years for something as basic as saying, stop discriminating, states, stop discriminating on the basis of race. And so even then, we didn't pass a law that covered everything. We made it something we had to I guess the best way I can put it is reauthorize.
Reauthorize, yeah.
Okay. And so after the original language, then we had some amendments, but we still had to come back to Congress and continue to reauthorize. The most recent was 2006, which we did with over 90 of the Senate agreeing that we still needed to do more. So one of the questions I pose to my students is, how did we move from 2006 reauthorization to a Supreme Court case in 2013 saying we don't have any problems with race and voting anymore, so we don't need Section 5, the pre-clearance part of the statute. We had learned from watching what happened during the 60s that those who were opposed to Black citizens voting would take all kinds of steps to prohibit it, Yet by the time you got into court and filed a lawsuit and had an opinion, the election was over. So Section 5 became critical to dealing with that reality. And 5-4 in Shelby versus Holder, the court said, well, we have a Black president. We don't have any problems with voting anymore. And the next day, literally, over 20 states immediately adopted much more restrictive laws that were intended, I would argue, to make it more difficult for racial minorities, those who spoke different languages, elders, and students to find it harder to participate.
And now here we are in 2021.
Well, now here we are.
Even farther.
We've gone even farther because guess what? People still try to exercise their right to vote. And those who were not happy with their choices said, wait a second, we've got to make it harder again. And the pandemic had created some of the momentum to make it easier to vote because people didn't want to get sick. But consider this. In most of the cases prior to the election, when the court was asked, can we make it easier? Invariably, they said no. If the state wants to continue to make it hard and make you get, say, 2 signatures before you can get an absentee ballot, oh, that's okay with us. They didn't say, oh, the state's trying to accommodate a 100-year pandemic. We should allow them to do that. No, instead it was, no. If they want to keep it the way it is, Wisconsin, Mississippi, whatever, we'll let you do that. That was, in my judgment, the key that this court, at least 5-4 at that time, was content with restrictions. But here's the tricky part. And I'll say this as quickly as I can because I don't want to spend all of our time talking about
That's money. Okay. That's all right.
But consider this, that after the election, with all of the charges of voter fraud, there were over 60 cases filed, and not one of them was successful on that issue. Just one said,
not one.
You may have observers move closer to watch the voting count. But that was it. Every other single case, no matter whether the judge was appointed by Obama or by Trump, said no. So that means there was no voting fraud. And we're not even going to talk about the government confirming that this was our most secure election. Okay, I'm not even going to go there yet. I'm simply saying that now we have a Supreme Court Justice, Justice Thomas, who says, well, if there is fear of fraud, that's enough to challenge election results. We've never had that standard as a nation. Why was that even thrown out into the middle of this?
Right.
To justify these cases, the efforts by 43 states now to make it more difficult to vote, just in the case of an allegation of fraud, not proof of fraud.
Right.
And I think that's reprehensible.
So you bring up Justice Thomas. So let's talk about that. That's a perfect segue to this next thing that I want to talk about, which is the fact that Anita Hill is a very dear friend of yours.
Yes. And
I want you to give us a little bit of the story of how she reached out to you and how it is that Charles Ogletree ended up being one of those who defended her during the 1991 hearings.
Well, when we finished Yale Law School, we both moved to Washington. And
you and Anita?
Anita and myself, yes. And I was working for a law firm. She was working for Clarence Thomas at the education department. And she eventually left to go to the University of Oklahoma after working at another law school. And as you know, Clarence Thomas was nominated by President George Herbert Walker Bush to replace Thurgood Marshall. And there was a lot of controversy over that appointment. I won't go into a lot of that, except to say that there were efforts to reach out to those who had information about Clarence Thomas that might affect the hearing. And so as part of that process were the Judiciary Committee, which was headed by Joe Biden, our current president. There were hearings, and after the first hearings, depending on those, the vote during that hearing, it would then go on to the Senate and he would be voted on. That's the normal process. But before that vote by the Judiciary Committee was taken, there was a leak to NPR and the Daily News that one of Clarence Thomas's former employees had given testimony, and it included charges of sexual harassment. Terrible turn of events across the board in terms of what should be done. And I was on vacation visiting some friends in California when I get a call from Anita. And she was upset for good reason, because she had given the testimony under oath, but it was supposed to be private and only for the committee. So an open question to this day is who released that information to the press. She asked me what should she do, and I gave her information that wasn't consistent with what she did. But as part of that, okay. what I told her was basically, I'll quote what I said. I said, "It doesn't matter what you say. He's going to be confirmed." And I was looking at what was happening in terms of vulnerable Democrats who felt that they were going to have to support him to keep their seats in red states. That's where I was coming from. And as it turned out, Justice Thomas had the closest vote in history to that point, and would not have been seated but for 4 of those 5 Democratic senators voting for him. Mm-hmm. That's our history. Mm-hmm. And so I said, it doesn't matter what you do. And I'm just concerned that people will try and harm you as a result of this leak. That was my concern. Mm-hmm. And also because we had been roommates during the time that this testimony would have covered, I said, I shouldn't be the one to represent you. The best person I can think of in the country is Charles Ogletree. And he's a personal friend. I respect him probably more than any other attorney I know. He would know what to do with this. I'm not saying he's going to figure out and take your case, but I'm willing to call him to ask him if he'll talk to you. And I did. And he did. And the rest, is history. Yeah. That's how that came about.
Unbelievable. What again, another backstory. How is she today, Anita?
She's great. She rebounded in a way that I don't think a lot of other people could have, but I think that was because of her inner strength and her faith and the fact that she had all of us supporting her as well. Mm-hmm. She was able to get past all of the ugliness that came out during that hearing and its aftermath, and go on to have a brilliant career at Brandeis University in Boston, where I think she's still a university professor there. So, and as you know, has continued to be an advocate for women's rights in the workplace and beyond. So we're exceptionally proud of Anita to this day.
Yeah. And Charles, after that time, continued his role as a professor at Harvard University.
Absolutely.
And but now he's undergoing some health challenges, and
Yes.
and you are a very close friend. So can you kind of bring people up to date on how Charles is doing now, and a little bit just about the strength of your friendship, because he's been like a big brother to you.
Absolutely. Well, again, if we go back to Stanford days, there weren't a lot of us during the early 70s.
It's true. There were not.
As you know.
I do.
And so the good part of that is it made for lifetime friendships. And I found over the course of my career, when I ran into trouble or wasn't sure which way to go, that he would almost invariably be one of the first people I would call and say, what should I do, Tree? What makes sense? And his advice invariably was reasoned and sensible and doable, all three. And the work he has done at Harvard is just extraordinary, especially with respect to the criminal justice clinic he put together, training attorneys from all over the country on how to be a better criminal attorney. Criminal justice wasn't my area. It was more constitution and civil rights more generally. But as we see from what's happening today with the George Floyd case and beyond, what happens within the criminal justice system affects us all. And he knew that and was aware of that and worked on that better than just about anybody else I can think of. There are other extremely capable attorneys, of course, but it was his ability to not only understand the issue and its importance to our nation, but to also train other attorneys on how to be the best criminal defendant, the best attorneys defending criminal defendants as possible. And that's a gift, a true gift. And I'm hoping that we'll see other folks pick up that legacy and bring it forward, and continue to bring it forward. I also remember, especially during the first decade of this century, his work on issues like reparations. Everybody else said, reparations, leave it alone, it's too difficult, no one wants to talk about it. That wasn't his approach. Instead it was, well, you need to talk about it and we need to sue and see what happens. And I would argue that the work he did during that early part of 2000 to 2008 advanced the issue in a way it had not been advanced before, by showing that even if you lose a case, if you're able to state a cause of action that requires attention, maybe we will be able to get to a point where we fix this. And I would argue HR 40 in the House right now can be attributed in part to the work that Charles Ogletree has done on this issue. And it's against that backdrop that we are saddened by the fact that he's been struggling with his health for the last 6 or 7 years, to the point that he did have to step down, which under other circumstances, I don't believe he would have. He would have worked to the very end because that's who he is. And I know that around the country, there are those who like me, have so benefited from his extraordinary leadership and friendship. And so whatever we can do to help the family, we're going to do. Yeah.
So if I'm not mistaken, I think one of the another prominent issue that Charles was involved in was working with the survivors of the Tulsa race massacre. You know anything about that? I know he was involved a little bit there.
Exactly. Well, the reason I knew about that was I had the honor of working with John Hope Franklin, one of our best historians on Black history, when he was appointed head of President Clinton's initiative on race. And he was also a resident of Tulsa when that horrible incident occurred. And so there had been a lot of discussion at different points of taking some type of concerted action to force Tulsa to acknowledge what had happened, that basically the Black community, which was called Black Wall Street in Tulsa, was essentially bombed after rumors that a Black man had insulted a white woman. And hundreds of Black Tulsa residents were killed and buried in unmarked graves. And Charles was one of a number of attorneys who said, we have to try and address this. Whether we characterize it as a form of reparations or just basic justice, it doesn't matter. We have to do something. And it was on that basis that he undertook that project too. Mm-hmm. Tulsa wasn't the only city. It was just one of the most visible. And we have seen a number of commissions since that time, but no final resolution still. Yeah. And again, that becomes something that we can teach new lawyers about so that they can then perhaps pick up that mantle and take it to the next level. But it still remains a major scar on our nation. And Charles was able to bring some light so that people who never heard about it, because it was not in our history books, can now have a record to show, here are survivors. We should be taking care of them. Why aren't we? And that's what he put on the table.
We'll probably never know the full impact that Charles has had and the number of lives that he's touched and impacted in just incredible ways. And how fortunate are we that, you know, that we've had the opportunity to be in his midst.
Oh, absolutely.
One of the greats.
Absolutely. And then I look at the work he did on behalf of Stanford. He was not just, okay, I'm here, I'm gone. He continued to support the university after he left. And those are the type of legacies I think that he has shown us that it's important to do those things.
Yeah. So when you look at the big picture of all the history that we've discussed, and then we fast forward to where we are in 2021, the racial reckoning that is going on, the divisions in the country, the conversations that are being had, voting rights being rolled back, et cetera. What are your hopes for our future and the steps that we need to take as a society to get to what inclusion should look like?
Wow. Well,
no big question there.
No big questions there. Just chatting between friends.
Just chatting.
Well, Linda, I would say a couple of things come to mind immediately. And if I go on too long, just stop me.
Okay.
I would start with the fact that we've been arguing more recently over that history of treating people with races different than the white race is okay. And it's been part of our history from the beginning. But now there have been efforts starting with the 1619 Project that was published in the New York Times and other major historical analyses that shows how race has continued to be an integral part of our public policies. How do we divide up benefits? How do we define what is discrimination or unequal treatment? That's all still true. And we had a chance to have a reset following the Civil War when slavery was finally abolished and we tried to reform our union. And that period was Reconstruction, But we know now from excellent scholarship that Reconstruction was sabotaged from the beginning. There was no ability to reset the clock, if you will, and say, okay, this group that we treated as not human, as not fully human, they are, and they're entitled to the same rights as everyone else. And so I would say, and yet at the same time, as soon as Black Americans were able to participate in the political process, they were what? They were electing senators and members of Congress to represent them. And I would argue that was one of the best achievements to follow the Civil War. But with the 1876 compromise over that presidential election, the federal troops were withdrawn, and those Southern governments that were never accepting of full citizenship for Black Americans reverted. And then we had that period from 1876 through 1964 of apartheid in America. So there are a lot of folks who believe that we should look at the civil rights years from 64 to 68 as the second Reconstruction, if you will. And we made progress, clearly, but as we saw with that first Reconstruction, there was immediate backlash, and it was brutal. And we saw that again after 68. So I would say one of the things I would probably not do is call this the third Reconstruction.
I was just going to ask you that. Why? Why would you not? Because you could say that when President Obama was elected, that was the progress. And then in 2016 was the backlash. But exactly. Why are you saying that is not the case?
No. I'm saying that's exactly the case. But
that's the case, but it's not the Reconstruction. It's not the Reconstruction.
Exactly.
Okay.
And
gotcha.
So what I would say there is, do we still need to do that work that could have been done in 1865? Absolutely. But I think we have to reimagine it in terms of how do we make it work from 2021 forward. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we are still experiencing a 100-year pandemic. And what has that one virus shown us in terms of the state of our union? We have seen disparities across every area. And I say that deliberately. We're talking public health, if we're talking education, if we're talking who received support from the government during the pandemic, if we're talking jobs and job loss. I could go on, but I won't, because you're getting the idea that my thought about this is that we should not just simply try and get back to the so-called normal. We should use this time to conceive of a better way forward, whether it's education and technology, whether it's healthcare and making sure there's cultural competence so that if I'm a Black woman showing up for healthcare, I get the same healthcare as anybody else. I mean, those basics are clearly on the table before us, and I haven't even gotten to the criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. So if we put all of that together, my thinking is not that we can't think of a term that would be reflective of the work that needs to be done. But I'm saying that we saw with the first and second Reconstruction that it wasn't enough. And the question now becomes, how can we make meaningful change that moves us forward as opposed to invite yet another massive backlash? That's what my thinking is on that.
Okay.
So
I was going to say the population demographics have changed considerably.
Yes.
And when you consider that in the not too distant future, the majority of the population will be Black and brown.
Absolutely.
Does that give you hope that we will, in fact, be able to do what you just suggested?
Well, yes.
Is that one of the differentiators between now and previous years?
Well, I think so. But I think we can go back a little bit to understand the impact of this racial and demographic shift on our politics. That we can look, for example, at 1993, the passage of the National Voter Registration Act as the high point of making voting easier. The idea behind that law, which I worked on for over 8 years, so I know it probably better than most, was that whenever someone comes into contact with the government, why don't you use that as an opportunity to make sure they can vote? Simple premise, yes?
Yeah, yeah.
But for those who want to make voting more difficult for various groups, which is our history, from day one to 1965, I would argue, there have been efforts even since the National Voter Registration Act was passed to limit it or make it more difficult for states to adopt it, okay? And so if that's the case, I think we have to then look at what happened next. And what happened next, in part, was President Clinton gave a speech, I think it was in San Diego, during his second term, where he acknowledged that fact of demographic change that you mentioned. And there was a backlash. And it was like, whoa, wait a second, we didn't know this was coming. And what does that mean? And then following the 2000 election, it was like, oh, we need more voter ID. And we didn't need voter ID. People know who they are. And we didn't have massive fraud. So why did the court 6-3 say, yes, it's reasonable, this is a good government kind of thing, and there should be no objection? Well, there shouldn't be any objection as long as the rules were reasonable. But what did we say? We saw, oh, if you have a student ID with your picture on it, that's not good enough. But if you have a fishing license, oh, that's great. Yeah. What was that about? I would argue it was a deliberate attempt to make it more difficult for those groups that were disfavored from participating in the process. Yeah. So now we jump to 2000, and we saw all of those lawsuits that I mentioned before the election. But now we have over 300 new laws that are being debated today after the election, even though every objective measure shows this was our most secure election ever, along with the greatest participation ever in terms of votes cast for the winning team versus the losing team. So I'm optimistic in the sense of this past election showed that even when under great threat, the American people can express their views in a way that should be respected. But I also look at how closely our Senate and our House of Representatives is divided at a time when we're about to go into the next phase of fairness in voting, and that's gerrymandering, where those in power try and protect their seats and are not concerned about an equal and even playing field. So we look at the census, the efforts to make that more difficult, so we are not counting all the people, and the census is critical to the process of redrawing districts. It all comes
connected
together.
Yeah,
it does.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to hear you say that you're hopeful, because that gives me hope. And I've got another quote that I want to share that came from that same article. And this is one of your friends talking about you, and she says, Sonia, has had plenty of reasons to be discouraged or angry, discriminated against when trying to rent housing in Los Angeles, followed around in stores when we shopped together to make sure she wasn't going to steal anything, unable to hail a taxi in New York City in the evening unless I stood in front of her. Instead, she elected to focus on humankind at its best and worked to create a more just world for all through her teaching, leadership contributions to social justice efforts, serving as legal counsel to others who had been mistreated, and perhaps most importantly, in seeing and appreciating all in everyday encounters. I love that quote. And it must make you feel a bit humbled. And I hope it makes you feel as though you are a stellar human being who has and continues to contribute so much to humankind. And that is the crux of all of this, is our ability to connect with each other on a human level. And when we can get there once and for all, we will be so much better off.
Well, that quote of all the quotes in that article probably got to me the most for so many different reasons. And I thank you for making that part of our discussion. I am very humbled by it. But I got lucky in the family sweepstakes. Two parents who wanted the best for me. And that becomes the way forward on so many different levels as I am in my 6th decade and recognizing what a difference it makes when you have support as opposed to when you do not. But that principle of, trying to treat people the way you'd like to be treated, some basics were part of my upbringing. So I give the credit to my folks. That's the first response I would make. And the second I would say is that I was fortunate to go to a great university for my undergraduate and a great law school for my legal training. And those skills I've been able to use in the best way I know how. That's how I would answer that question. And I view it as an honor to be able to represent those who need assistance and in a way that I can provide it. You don't always win, as you know, it's a process. But if you feel that you've given it your best, that's really the best we can do. And it's that combination that has continued to inspire me to teach students, to file lawsuits, to rabble-rouse a little bit. I'm still not done with the NCAA on that training issue, but I'm just saying, get ready, folks.
Just saying. And we come full circle, right back to where we started. So yeah, go get them. I mean, if anybody ought to be able to help them make a difference, it's you. You were there when it started.
Well, it's just, again, I am just so excited for our team to reach its 3rd national championship. The women who played and represented our school did a wonderful job. But again, to have Black coaches in the Final Four, I mean, come on.
No. Again, yeah, one of them from Houston. Hello, one of them from Houston.
That's my point. It was
yes.
Wow, so many different pieces were coming together all around this. And then after the school had shined this light in a way that I had not expected, has just been tremendous. And as I said, very, very humbling. And hearing from friends and teammates and classmates around the country over the last 2 months has just been off the charts. I can honestly say that.
Well, bask in that light. You deserve it.
Well, thank you, Linda. And I really want us to do the best we can to continue honoring Charles Ogletree.
Yes.
Because he has been so instrumental, not just to me, but to so many other people I could point to. And I'm hoping that we can do our best to show him and his family how much he means to us.
Absolutely. Just so beautifully said. And what a beautiful way for us to end. Sonia, it has been such a pleasure catching up with you and having this meaningful conversation. And I'm such a fan, and I look forward to seeing all the great things that I know you're going to continue to do. And if I can ever support you in any way, you know I'm here for you.
Well, Linda, I do know that. And when my next book on voting comes out, I'll come and bug you and say, let's talk about the book. How about
Please.
that? Please.
Can't wait. All right. Open invitation.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so
dear.
much. Take
Thank
care.
you for having me. Bye now.
Bye. I so appreciate all of you for spending part of your day and taking time to enjoy this conversation that I just had with Sonia Jarvis, and for learning more about our dear friend, Charles Ogletree. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast and be sure to like and share and spread the word among your friends. We so appreciate everything that you bring to the Our Voices Matter podcast community. Thanks again for giving Sonia permission to speak and for having the courage to listen with an open mind. We'll see you next time.